forces of Ukraine have successfully advanced in the areas of several settlements in the Sumy region. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. They also clarified that the enemy suffered significant losses in manpower. Ukrainian soldiers showed one of the routes of Russian forces in the North Slobozhanske direction and emphasized that not only enemy personnel and equipment are being destroyed, but also their logistics. The combat mission of the GUR unit is to make any enemy movement impossible, cutting the invaders off from supplies of ammunition, fuel, food, and other resources. Military intelligence operatives control the area, destroying everything Russian that moves on the ground or in the air. This is according to a report from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine on Telegram. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Serhii, also called the Kursk operation successful. He noted that its main goal, to divert Russian troops and equipment from other directions, was fully achieved. Victories love silence. They are born in silence and prepared in silence. When an information campaign is launched and everyone is shouting, "Give me this, give me that," then, of course, the enemy knows as well and prepares just the same. This time, we had to win. Without the North Koreans, they wouldn't have achieved any success at all. Serhii, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in an interview with the Washington Post. 23 times, Russian troops unsuccessfully tried to break through the defense forces' positions in the Pokrovsk direction. Ukrainian soldiers steadfastly repelled enemy attacks near 13 settlements. As military experts note, the Russians will try until a certain point, with September 1st mentioned in the information space, to enter Pokrovsk and get involved in urban combat.
Here, the Russians might end up stepping on their own rate. First of all, no one has actually said that they can, or rather, to be more precise, that they will be able to start fighting specifically in the urban agglomeration. And secondly, we understand perfectly well that Pokrovsk is a defensive area where every location also has additional protective redoubts.
Ukrainian soldiers note that an active drone war continues near Pokrovsk and along the entire front line. The fields are covered with a network of fiber optics, like a wire trap. There isn't a single area where the fiber optics don't run. And with the help of such drones, Ukrainian soldiers are inflicting significant losses on the enemy. With the help of UAVs on fiber optics near Vovchansk, the fighters are turning enemy equipment into scrap metal. After all, the electronic warfare systems that the Russians install on their vehicles can't interfere with the border guards' effective operations. We've made a lot of progress, and then with a needle, from the other side, beyond the village, and through the farms. So, we took up positions just fine, stormed them, stood under Vovchansk for a long time, and now we've moved to the Pokrovsk direction. So, what's up? We're ready to storm the tree lines here too. On the southern Slobozhanske direction, free firefights were recorded. The Russian occupiers unsuccessfully tried to attack the defense forces' positions in the areas of Vovchansk and Kolodysk. Ukrainian soldiers repelled 12 more Russian assaults in the Novopovlivka direction, 5 in the Lyman direction, and 4 in the Kramatorsk direction. 2 Russian attacks were repelled each in the Toretsk and Orikhiv sectors, 1 each in the Siversk and Kupiansk directions, and another 6 in the Pridniprovsk direction. The enemy is trying to push Ukrainian defenders out of their positions on the left bank of the Dnipro River, as well as increase its presence in the island zone. Just last week, Russian occupiers tried to storm our positions 31 times. All attacks were repelled. As military experts note, the enemy continues to send its soldiers into so-called meat grinder assaults, unsuccessfully trying to achieve any kind of result. After all, Ukrainian defense forces destroy their equipment very quickly.
The concept of losses isn't even considered by the Russian side. Only the result matters to them. And that's why, in our army slang, there's now this concept called flag sticking. That is, when a Russian soldier manages to run to a certain point, sticks a flag in, and is immediately killed, usually by strikes from our drones, our artillery, or our troops.
Ukrainian soldiers blew up a field depot with fuel and lubricants, as well as a Russian T-72 tank, in the Kupiansk direction. In addition, Ukrainian soldiers delivered a powerful strike against the positions of Russian occupiers on another one of the hot fronts. There, 2 Russian Stubby howitzers, a D-20 gun, and a drone takeoff and landing pad were taken out. Just in the past day, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 4 Russian tanks and 7 armored fighting vehicles, 37 artillery systems, and 2 multiple rocket launchers. In addition, over the past day, 1,000 Russian occupiers were eliminated. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Russian army has lost more than 1,064,000 soldiers.
We're discussing the situation at the front with Serhii Bratchuk. He is the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. Good evening. Serhii, glory to Ukraine.
Glory heroes, defense, colleagues.
Let's go into a bit more detail. The situation at the front. We'd like to hear your analysis. We've already read out the general staff's report, but we're interested in more detail, more specifics. What's happening at each important section of the front? Please.
Well, today, every location is important for us. Some of them might be less known or more well known in the media. The Pokrovsk direction remains the enemy's top priority. There's nothing new I can say in terms of its priority. However, it's clear today that the Russians have some kind of deadline, a certain timeline and calendar they're trying to follow. It's quite likely that, in addition to the flanking maneuvers they're currently carrying out, targeting Minograd and Dobropilia, they'll also try, quite possibly, to launch a frontal assault, maybe even using mechanized units. But the most important thing today is that the enemy is trying to attack and, well, advance along the flanking positions. And today, sabotage and reconnaissance groups are operating very actively, usually followed by assault units. They may not be at full strength, just like the current sabotage and reconnaissance groups, because for now, the enemy is still preparing for these strikes, creating the necessary conditions for themselves. But it's clear that, as I already mentioned, their priority is the Pokrovsk direction and Pokrovsk. The thing is, apparently, the Russians are trying, by a certain date that's been mentioned in the media, September 1st, to possibly enter into urban combat. However, here the Russians might end up falling into their own trap. First of all, no one has actually said that they will be able to, or rather, to be more precise, that they will be able to start fighting specifically in the urban agglomeration. And secondly, we understand perfectly well that Pokrovsk is a defensive area where every location also contains additional defensive redoubts. That includes the railroad, industrial zones, and high-rise buildings, in other words, places where you can dig in to defend. That's why, in any case, Russian troops today have to advance and take losses. And most importantly, the enemy really doesn't spare their own people these days. The enemy doesn't spare their manpower and keeps pushing them forward. That's what has allowed the Russians to make these tactical advances so far. But if we go back to the map, starting from the north and moving south, the North Slobozhanske direction refers to the Sumy region. As of today, we can see that the defense forces have managed to prevent a blitzkrieg by the Russian troops. Secondly, in some locations, it was possible to liberate several settlements and push the enemy back. Today, the idea of creating some kind of buffer zone by the Russian Federation in the Sumy region is no longer being discussed. Now, it's about the Russians trying to hold on to at least the locations where they are currently fighting. Very fierce fighting is taking place in Yurakivka. You know, this is one of the main directions of the Russian offensive in the Sumy region. Accordingly, these battles are taking place right in the settlement itself. And Alexivka is also a settlement, quite an important one, and the Russians are trying to defend it, although according to some reports, we can already say today that our sabotage and reconnaissance groups are able to infiltrate this location as well, to carry out sabotage and so panic among enemy ranks, because the situation in the Sumy region is turning out to be quite unfavorable for the Russians at the moment. We can't say yet that we've managed to push the enemy back to the border, or even more so, to give them the opportunity to retreat back into Russian territory. But in any case, the current parity that has been established is temporary and dynamic, and overall, the advantages are still on the side of our defense forces. And it's obvious that in the Kharkiv direction, in the Volchansk area, the enemy is trying to show some activity. At the moment, it isn't critical, unlike the Lyman, Kupiansk, and Sibirsk directions on the front, where the situation is currently not very favorable for Ukrainian defense forces. At the very least, the Russians, as they try to bring certain forces into battle, are once again using their old tactics, those well-known pincer movements, to create so-called pockets and try to trap the defense forces there. So far, our units have been able to repel enemy attacks. I think the next few days, maybe a few weeks, will show how the situation develops, whether it becomes more critical or, let's say, everything remains fundamentally unchanged. And of course, there's the Zaporizhzhia front, the Pridneprovsk direction, and the Kherson region. Let me focus on the Zaporizhzhia direction, the Yuliapol direction. Today, well, the state of this part of the front also depends, among other things, on the enemy's offensive along the Novopavlivka axis of advance. This is an element of the enemy's Pokrovsk offensive, and if yesterday the Lyman direction was the enemy's second priority, then over the past day, the Novopavlivka direction has once again taken the lead, an unpleasant distinction, but it's true. The situation there also affects the Yuliapol direction. On the Zaporizhzhia front, the enemy is showing activity here. The enemy is trying to attack in the area of Kamiansk, but can't gain a foothold, even though the settlement itself no longer exists. But really, it's the same old story I mentioned before. The enemy destroyed the settlement. Now they can't establish themselves in this gray zone either. They're being destroyed by the fire from our units. Accordingly, in the Orkhov direction today, just like on the entire Zaporizhzhia front, there is a regrouping of troops with assault units. It's quite possible that reserves could be brought in to intensify combat operations in Zaporizhzhia. And, in fact, when we talk about the Pridneprovsk direction, that's the Kherson direction, it's often covered in the media. Everything happening on the Kherson front is frequently accompanied by Russian information and psychological operations. We can see that the strikes carried out by Russian aviation on the bridge over the Dnipro, the one over the corresponding Kashavaya River toward the island, in the Korabelny district of Kherson, were accompanied by equally strong information support. Why did Russian electronic warfare systems in Arzamas direct one of our drones into a residential building? But that's something all Russians should take up with their own air defense. That's their problem. That's why ours are hitting exactly where they're supposed to. That's why the far-reaching plans in this strategy are obvious, and we see these targets: the military-industrial complex, the oil refining sector, and of course, logistics. These include railway lines and automated control systems. So today, these are the Achilles heels, those that our troops, our defense forces, have found in the Russian army, in the Russian war machine that is fighting against our forces. And accordingly, this is what should have. If we're talking about fuel, for example, this is what should have ended up, in particular, in Pokrovsk or Zaporizhzhia.
Serhii, thank you so much for taking the time to join our broadcast. Serhii Bratchuk was with us, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army.